Well, friends, another week of fun readings. Easy to understand and easy to preach. Please note the sarcasm. I personally wish that both Job and this portion of Mark could come with some type of disclaimer or warning. While there is so much truth within them, they're also, in my opinion, easily misread and misinterpreted, misapplied and misused, and sometimes end up causing more harm than good. I would personally want to start by saying proceed with caution. Today's passages do remind us that there is a lot of suffering in the world. Although I'm not sure that we need much of a reminder, just turn the news on this last week. We see these international conflicts, wars, and possible leading up to war. We have natural disasters with too many lives lost and property destroyed. And then there's political polarization. Then, as the passages also point out, there's more personal suffering, the loss of loved ones and financial security, illness, power dynamics and struggles that try to tempt and test us, and the pain of divorce and the severing of all different types of relationships. It all reminds us that life is hard sometimes. And some of us might want to say life is hard most of the time. For the next 4 weeks, we get a very abridged version of Job. Somehow, the Revised Common Lectionary has pared down 42 chapters into just 4 readings. Now, what I do recommend, if you haven't done this before, is to sometime over the next few weeks, maybe while you're hunkered down waiting for a hurricane to pass over, read through Job in one sitting. It sounds different. It reads differently if you read it as one. It might help you in a time of suffering, in a time of discomfort, a time of great anxiety, like a hurricane. Some people do find great comfort in Job, and others, understandably, aren't really sure what to make of it. And I do think we need to be careful when we do read Job. I don't believe that Job is meant to be read literally. I don't believe that it's proof that God allows Satan to test us. It just doesn't fit with my personal theology. I also don't think that it's meant to answer the questions of why do bad things happen to good people, although it would be nice to have that answer. As Joy J. Moore puts it, even the character of Satan is less about even the character of Satan is less here about the proof that this evil one exists and more about what is in us that causes us to accuse God of being anything less than good or anything less than trustworthy. I personally think that Job is simply meant to provide space for the hard questions to be asked, to acknowledge that there is pain and grief and sometimes just to sit in it, to find assurance in God's presence no matter how dark the day may feel. So why 42 chapters to say all that? Possibly because we can't avoid pain and we can't rush grief. Sometimes we just have to sit in it for a while. And then we get this gospel reading about divorce. It's important first to remember that what Moses and then Jesus were referring to as marriage is not what we have as marriage as an institution today. Marriage looked and functioned completely different. And so in many ways, what we're talking about is apples to oranges. And I think that's just helpful to keep in the back of our minds. It's also a bit poetic in a rather tragic Shakespearean type of way that we are here talking about divorce in our gospel reading today when just yesterday afternoon we celebrated a wedding in this space. That's why there's still rose petals on the floor, as a visual reminder of the joyful event that happened in our community just yesterday. Chris Hogan, the groom, grew up in this church. In fact, he was the first acolyte to serve at Iona Hope. And Alicia, his bride, is this beautiful woman and a wonderful companion. They really seem like a close to perfect match. And I'm excited to see where life takes them together. I have this sense that God has big plans for them. Now, for their wedding, I was asked if I would offer a brief homily. I tried to get out of it, but they wanted it. This summary of this message that I offered to them yesterday was that we live in a world of noise, a cacophony of pain, a discord of anger and hatred, a world of noise. But that within that world of noise, Chris and Alicia have a chance to dampen down that disharmony with their beautiful music of love. My prayer for them is that love, which the world witnesses through their union, is always louder than all of the noises that surround them. And I believe, in part, that is what marriage is meant to be, a living example of love. Now, God is love. That I am sure of. And we can't see God directly, or at least most of us can't, but we can witness God in the many ways that love flows through this world. And so when any of those relationships that once had the flow of love, the flow of God going through them, once those relationships, including marriage, break down, it can often, but not always, work against that message of love. And that's why there's words of caution around the idea of divorce. But saying that the truth is, we live in this world of now and not yet. We strive to be and to experience God's love and restorative power, but that just is not always the reality. We strive for thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, but some days it feels like that is not much more than a prayer that we long to be answered. We live in a world with a lot of noise, and sometimes that noise begins to become overwhelming. We live in a world where there are mistakes and bad choices. We live as we strive to live as God guides us, but none of us get it right all the time. And so sometimes the severing of relationships is the best option in the broken world that we are a part of. So having a simple black and white reading on divorce coming from a gospel reading like today just does not sit right with me. It's too complex for that. So what is Jesus talking about in this passage? Let's take a look a little more closely. Jesus' teaching comes as a result of the Pharisees once again trying to test Jesus. They're trying to trap him so they can discredit him. So maybe that they can reclaim some of the prestige and power and popularity that they once had. And I would suggest that part of the Pharisees' goal is to maintain patriarchy. And that's because the family unit was seen as a microcosm of the larger societal order, one which men held the authority and control. Thus, they benefited as the Pharisees to maintain this patriarchal system of marriage. If it breaks down here, it's more likely to break down here, and then they lose their power. I believe that Jesus' response indicates many things, more than I can get into in a single sermon, but ultimately that God desires unity, relationships, and interdependence. And one thing that divorce is a severing of relationships. This is not what God longs for. But as I said, we live in this broken world, this world of now and not yet. And one of the realities of not yet is that relationships are messy. And they cannot always be reconciled or worked through this side of heaven, because we're all still dealing with our own brokenness. Essentially, there is this ideal on one hand, and the reality of the present on the other. And while I think we're called to do our best to live into that ideal, it's just not always possible. And this is what the law of Moses was about. It was a compromise that tried to hold both reality and ideal together in balance. And Moses' law was actually a step towards providing a level of security and protection for women. Providing that certificate of divorce was better than what had been the norm if a man wanted to break away his union with his wife. The certificate was to give women a little bit more protection than what had existed at that time. And what Jesus does then is to take it a step further, especially when he mentions that a woman could divorce a man. That was unheard of at the time. See, he recognizes the law of Moses did not go far enough to protect women. His response was against the Pharisees' patriarchal worldview and strives to bring further equality, to protect women in the present, in the reality at that time, all while trying to honor this ideal of unity, reality, and ideal. Jesus is again looking out for the underdog, the least in society, and in this time it was women. By teaching against divorce, Jesus was protecting women from destitution that they would most certainly have faced if they were cut off from their husband. Divorce would have put the woman at grave disadvantage while barely impacting the man. So this lifting up the least was something that Jesus cared greatly about. So much so that we then see it occurring in a different way in the second paragraph that we have in today's reading. Jesus invites children to come to him and receive a blessing. As I stated a couple weeks ago, while parents of children would presumably have this innate love for their children, society as a whole viewed children as less than, insignificant, and at times nothing but a burden. They certainly would not want children making noise in their worship space. Jesus, by reprimanding the disciples and welcoming the children, showed another way of breaking down society's view and preaching the truth that all are beloved by God. That man, woman, or non-binary, old or young, married, unmarried, or divorced, all are God's, and all are of extreme value. That's what Jesus preaches. So in a world of pain and suffering, God is constantly calling humanity together because love cannot happen in a vacuum, but requires relationships for love to flow. Relationships are required for love to be witnessed, experienced, known, and carried on. God is constantly drawing people together because love wins in the end. So in all of our relationships, let's make sure that the melodies of love dampen out the noisy dissonance of the world's brokenness. Let's believe out loud. Let's love out loud. Amen.